Good afternoon, everyone. It's almost 4:20, and now I think we can get started. I welcome you all here in this room. The topic of this presentation is the intersection of telco standards and cloud-native automation principles through open source. Before that, I will like to introduce myself. I am Sana Tariq. I'm a PhD in computer science, and I'm a principal technology architect in the Chief Technology Office at TELUS. I'm leading cloud and service orchestration program. I'm also the lead of TELUS Open Source Program Office. And I love open source. I have been working in open source for quite some time, and I happen to be a founding member of the Project Nephio. Have been working with this community since the beginning. And right now, I have the privilege to work as vice chair in the Project Nephio and the chair of SIG Architecture and Requirements Group. Let's glance through the agenda. I'll first walk you through the telco transformation and our journey that we have taken in virtualization to cloudification. Next, I'll walk you through some challenges that we are facing in the container network functions and our approaches that we're using in the automation. Then we'll talk about how can we drive standards and open source and how to drive the convergence. And in the end, I'll give you a sneak peek into Project Nephio from a lens of a service provider and what that means for us and how the existing brownfield looks like and how can we converge that with the Project Nephio's vision. This is a level setting side, and I wanted to give you a little bit of perspective on what are the important priorities for telcos and service providers, carriers, how we call it in the future. So the space here are the services and the apps that we are using in our everyday life. And the digital transformation has transformed a lot of the things that we are doing in our everyday life, from our shopping, dining, travel, health. TELUS happens to be participating in a lot of these verticals. And that's where the value chain is shifting. I remember this morning I met a high schooler who is 17 years old and who is already working in open source projects, and he's contributing a lot of code. So one thing that came to my mind is that is the generation that we satisfy. So we are going to find these high demand customers in the future, and that's what we need to satisfy through the digital transformation happening in this layer. So telcos, if they are contributing in this layer, that's where the customer relationship is happening, and that's where the value chain and the revenue making is shifting. If we are not participating in this layer, then telcos still provide the connectivity services, but they're actually reduced to data pipes, and that's what we should not let happen. The transformation across this layer is directly proportional to the evolution that is happening in the technology stack underneath. So the cloud that we build, the transport network that we are working with, the O-RAN technologies, all have to be open, flexible, very cloud native and agile, and everything that we are doing in our operations have to be driven by cloud native mindset. That's when the innovation in the services layer will be possible. So telcos have made a significant amount of progress across all these different verticals to date. If you look at how ETSI and 3GPP has evolved, it has actually helped us achieve a lot of disaggregation in the software level. We are a lot more open than before, and a lot of evolution in that space has happened and is happening. Looking at the DevOps transformation, our organizations across the world, all the telcos have actually moved their tools, the teams, the skill set, the mindset. We have achieved a significant amount of progress in the DevOps transformation. There was a time when telcos were barely understanding the concept of NFV, and today we have the most sophisticated private and public cloud, building a hybrid cloud strategy. The private and the public cloud options are increasingly growing their capabilities to serve the telco workloads, and we have a lot of options and flexibilities to build our strategy today. Application modernization. This is a very critical subject, and I would love to touch this again during my presentation. We were at PNFs, and then we moved to something called VNFs, and now we are at CNFs. So the evolution is still happening, but there is a lot that still needs to happen at that level. Software and open source. A significant amount of realization happened in the world of telcos. Now we understand that software is extremely important for us across all the verticals of our business. And open source, we are significantly understanding the strategy of open source is very important. If you attended a session from this morning where TELUS did a keynote and Walter shared with you that TELUS became a governing board member of Linux Foundation, that is what is happening in the form of open source in TELUS at the moment. We are increasingly interested in building an open source strategy. Automated operations, something that we have made some progress with at day 0, day 1, but there is a very slow pace with our day 2 plus ops management, and there is a lot of heterogeneity and complexity in that space, which I'll touch upon, and I will discuss why we are so complex in the approach that we're using for automation today. So let's dive into the evolution of our telco network functions. I remember in 2017, I had a workshop where Arpit and Dan was alive at that time. We were trying to understand the concept of CNFs. And since that time until now, we have not yet made our CNFs truly cloud native. Telco network functions have gone through a massive standardization, and the RFCs and standards that are actually written for the telco networks are very, very complex. And the code that goes into our applications is written a long time ago, and there is a lot of legacy code in that. So the applications that are there today that are responsible for deriving a critical network services is very monolithic in nature. How do we transform and refactor and modernize those monolithic applications into something called microservices-based architecture? That evolution is simpler for the IT world, but this evolution is not so simple for the telco workloads because there is a lot of complexity associated with how the code is written and how the standards are actually embedded inside that legacy code. Now, standards and our vendors and our customer SLAs and how the evolution of the cloud is happening and how open source is driving all of that, there is a lot of momentum and a lot of work happening in transitioning this space, which will actually enable us to become cloud native. Another important aspect on being cloud native are the ability to solve the 12 factors. These 12 factors I have published a couple of times across many communities, and if you look at the Project Nephio website, myself and the Google team actually worked and looked at that, and we felt that these telco network function 12 factors are actually responsible for deriving the evolutionary ecosystem that will enable the vision of Nephio and cloud native as well. So these, when I explained the 12 factors within my organization, we had a mandate to include these 12 factors in every single RFP going out. But the state in the vendors community, when I was receiving the responses, was not very promising. We have made a long way into how the 5G core evolved from being super close to be somewhat open today. And there are varying levels of their cloud nativeness depending on which kind of vendors you're working with. ORAN is extremely immature, and they're too far from realizing the cloud native vision, and there's no compliance to the 12 factors at the moment. That is something that we have to see coming along the way as we are getting more mature in the ORAN evolution. Something that I would put as a responsibility on the carriers and service providers is that we need to work on this evolution. We need to work with the vendors that we are directly participating with, and we need to make this more important in the form of our requirements, not just something sitting on the roadmap, and we use the terms like transformation or evolution or a journey and a long-term roadmap, because that's what I really dislike about the concept. Imagine a monolithic application when that sits on your public cloud that is wasting a lot of resources on the public cloud, and it's not capable of interacting with about 80% of environment services that exist on the cloud. So you're wasting all the software resources, and the business case of a big monolithic application putting it on the public cloud is a very poor business case. You don't want that to happen. So the agility and our ability to automate, ability to use the cloud resiliency functions are all dependent on how well we are structured within the application construct and how well we are exploiting the cloud. Building the cloud doesn't mean that we are using the cloud. I think one definition of cloud native is that we should be able to use cloud the way the cloud was designed and built. And let's dive more into how we are consuming the cloud APIs and cloud resources and why our automation is also not using the right principles. So this is an interesting slide where I wanted to give you a perspective of how we compare Nephio with the existing brownfield. I have been working on automation for the last 5 years, and if I could walk you through the existing brownfield, the left-hand side here is the situation of our current automation paradigm. What we are doing today is that we have a large number of network functions. I have shown them all with the different colors. There are standards that play in the space called ETSI, and ETSI has a relatively slow release of RESPECs and their APIs across SOL X. They have done some good work, and the adoption of the vendors across these different ETSI APIs is even slower in that sense. So if you look at these components called VNF managers and EMSs, they have about 40% of proprietary APIs still. So if you look at this layer called service orchestration level, which develops templates like network service descriptors, and we are using some declarative models like NSDs written in Tosca, which actually hide some of the abstract some of the complexity of your lower levels, but it's still not doing this in a very efficient way. And every single VNF manager, because there are 40 to 50% of the API still very proprietary, we need to work with those vendors and use their professional services. So the total cost of ownership in this kind of automation paradigm is very complex and very expensive. If you see how we are managing our infrastructure, the infrastructure is managed by our different kind of models, for example, Terraform or Ansible, or all those constructs exist, and they're quite mature in the space. But that activity is out of band with the activity of deploying and managing your network functions. Now, one more thing is very interesting. There is only file and forget mode right now. So most of these we are using Helm-based deployments. Helm chart itself is very complex in nature. And if I could introduce you to some of the 5G and IoT cores that I worked with, there is one example in which there are 89 microservices. So imagine the complexity of the Helm chart and how their subcharts are organized. And then you look at the value files. The value files have to be reset every time when you're deploying it in one place or the other place, and that requires a lot of prescriptive manual configurations to your files. So that is the brownfield. And that is the existing state of our network functions. And we are almost treating our network functions as pets. And there's a huge operational cost associated with that. Let me walk you through the very similar design on what we would do if we have to replace this vision with Nephio. So Nephio is based on Kubernetes. And we all know how big the community of Kubernetes grew in the last few years. The simplicity, the flexibility, the containers adoption all over the world has made this one of the most successful open source projects, probably after Linux. So the extension of Kubernetes has been tested for time and scale in its ability to do the closed loop in terms of reconciling your actual state to the desired state. This is an in-band, in-sync exercise. If you're deploying your infrastructure or deploying your CNF or configuring your CNF, you have to develop your operators, your CRDs. Let me go back. So you need to develop your custom resources, the ones that are described only for the telco network functions, and it goes outside the visibility and control of Kubernetes. You define your customer resources for that. And you define the state of those in your CRDs, and then you make operators on the top to ensure that there is a loop running on it to constantly reconcile your actual state to the desired state that you intended in your CRD. Now, if we had a typical lightweight IT-based network function, we could just use Kubernetes to do the lifecycle management like we could do this in the IT world. But in the telco network functions, like we talked about, there are so many different constructs that we need to define. For example, the SRIOE, DPDK, CPU pinning, huge pages, all of those could become the CRs, and we can extend the general purpose control plane of Kubernetes to actually see that. And all those customizations can be masked and abstracted within this control loop. The policy that we write in this model, the traditional brownfield model, we need to write a different policy in each of these individual VNF managers, and sometimes in this level. And for each policy writing, we have to absorb the KPIs from all these different elements and build plugins here and take the data here and then try to build the lifecycle management. That's how we achieve our day 2. But here, we can rely on Kubernetes control loop to achieve the day 2 plus or the automated operations in a very cloud native way. So using Nephio and the vision of Nephio, there is a lot of simplicity that we can derive from this model. And this model is actually mastering the complexity. It's not that we have not yet made progress with that. We have made a lot of progress moving forward with that, but it's still extremely complex, and there is a lot of work that we have to do every time we are building our automation around this. TELUS has even worked on bypassing VNF managers and the EMSs. So even before Nephio, we realized that the VNF managers should be eliminated from our network. And we have done a lot of 5G core deployments, and we are on our path to remove our dependencies from these elements, which will actually make your network functions more accessible and open to the DevOps teams, and they can actually work with them, as we need to take that control and we need to take that into a self-serve mode rather than depending on vendors to do the work for us. And with that, we're also looking at a possibility that we can share the The Kubernetes happens to be the common denominator across a lot of our private and public clouds, which is actually giving us an opportunity that we can share skill sets across the industry, and which is also creating a possibility for us that there is no vendor lock-in, and we can actually find a way to find open stacks all around us. And our hybrid cloud strategy can be built on that vision if we are using Kubernetes and operators and just the constructs that support that common platform in the form of open source. In these two slides, I have actually built a comparison in line by line to give a recap on what we discussed in the last few slides. So the infrastructure configuration on the left-hand side is how we are following that in the status quo, the existing brownfield. And on the right-hand side is a Project Nephio, how we are going to approach that for both day 0 and day 2. The current deployment models, like we talked about, the Terraform, Ansible, and the Helm is very prescriptive, while Nephio is going to be more declarative. The policy and control loops are difficult to scale and manage, while in the Kubernetes, there is a natural mechanism of developing your closed loop, which can take care of day 2+ in reconfiguration, upgrade, backup, and failover. Similarly, in the network function deployment, we talked about how ETSI is playing a role in that, and the deployment approach in the Nephio could be all just based on the Kubernetes extensions and constructs. Configuration is a very complex space at the moment. And there is a lot of work that needs to happen at the way the network functions evolve and actually support the Nephio declarative configuration model. And there is a lot of work that has to happen in the transformation of the network functions and the evolution of this overall ecosystem. There is a business side of comparison as well. So if we have a very large number of VNF managers, the total cost of ownership of that actually increases. And the amount of professional services that we are paying to a lot of vendors, just because we cannot understand what goes into the proprietary interfaces and APIs, is also something that we should not be moving forward with. The proprietary solutions are going to be proprietary, and it's very difficult to actually find a skill set that can understand so much of heterogeneity across all these different types of tools that are coming with each vendor and which are not relying on the Kubernetes projects internally. There is a little bit of comparison done on the templates. Helm-based instantiation is generally used in the Kubernetes for day 1, which is fire and forget, while operators are more powerful and they're intent-based and they're designed more for stateful applications. Like we discussed, Helm is complex and the value files gets very complex, while operators are more declarative and they have more shifting of work happening at the design time, and the runtime becomes slightly simplified for us. Service providers and telcos have actually a huge role to play in how we can drive this ecosystem forward. There is a lot of work that we can do in the standards to converge their vision into the open source and cloud native technologies. We can work with all the cloud providers to drive a vision in which we can drive interoperability and can simplify some of the deployment and operations. We need to work with the network function vendors to comply with 12 factors and the cloud native principles. And open source is actually playing a huge role, and it's central to all this evolutionary ecosystem around us. I'm actually working in the Project Nephio, and some of the smartest people that I came across are from other service providers and vendors who have a very strong understanding of what it takes us to be cloud native. And those people are actually driving this community forward in a very efficient way. And I'm excited to see the progress of the Nephio project and look forward to how the community is going to participate and how vendors are going to contribute more operators over the next few months and years, and how this is actually evolving to converge in the brownfield that I presented. And this is the work that we have to collectively do as a community. I'll open the floor for questions and see if there is anything that people would still want to ask. How do I? How does? There is a button. See, how would this open? Yeah, it's working now.
Testing, all right. Thank you. This was a really great presentation, and I think you did a great job kind of summarizing along the way. I had some questions around when you talked about observability and tying into the various EMSs and all of that, do you think what's provided in Nephio, the scope of what's provided in Nephio, could it handle all kind of service assurance needs? Do you still need closed loop automation above what Nephio would provide?
Yeah.
So I guess kind of what functions from a day two operations do you think
Yeah.
would be provided there versus otherwise?
Yes. So, like I said, Nephio is a vision. It's, of course, not a magic. So in order for Nephio to be successful, we need to see more and more cloud-native functions in the world. And by the definition of the cloud-native, if I actually go back to see those 12 factors, because we didn't have time to go through each one of these again and again, if you look at the observability, this actually means that we need to put our KPIs and performance indicators inside something like Prometheus, which actually gives Kubernetes level the control and visibility into what is happening. If it is siloed into another construct like EMS, and if you are still using SNMP-based protocols, Kubernetes is not going to get the control and vision into that. And I don't think that Nephio can solve that problem. Nephio is actually dependent on the ecosystem evolution to drive some of that transformation through this community, that eventually we will give Kubernetes the control that it deserves and can actually play a part in the lifecycle management like the way you mentioned. So we need to evolve to get to that stage and take us to that level.
Does Nephio assume that we'll only have the greenfield deployment?
So there is a lot of work that has to happen. And some of the discussions that we do in our SIG architecture and requirements is that how do we define the scope of Nephio and how do we find the convergence from Nephio's existing scope and tie this with a lot of brownfield, that is the ETSI or ONAP and these network slicing, the 3GPP stack. That work has to happen, and that's something that we will actually develop and evolve to that architecture. There is some documentation on the Nephio website that was presented in the beginning on the initial vision of how Nephio's scope is and how that actually intersects with the rest of the ecosystem. You can see how it's participating in the ORAN, how is it participating with the ONAP. So it assumes that it will intersect with the existing brownfield, but that's evolving. I need to see how the community drives it and where we eventually take it. My personal vision, it's my personal vision, is that if it can solve in the short term the problem of how we put the functions on the cloud and manage them, it's a huge win. If we just solve that, a lot of the existing standard-based orchestration that exists in the brownfield today can actually handle the rest very well, because there is a lot of maturity and evolution happening there. And if it grows its scope from the network function, deployment, and lifecycle management all the way to the services and network slicing, we'll see how the community plays with that. Both are possible, actually. If you build operators on operators, you can go all the way to network slicing. But it depends on how we are evolving this community, how we are playing that, how you are playing that as a community.
Right. My question basically came from the fact that in the morning, in the Nephio talk, they talked about that there was an assumption about no auto-band management. And then that's essentially, factors out that there is no brownfield. There will only be greenfield. So.
Yeah, John's here in the room, but no out-of-band management. The way I understand the Nephio's concept is that for the infrastructure configuration and the network function deployment and the network function configuration all has to be an in-band activity. So the way we do our infrastructure configuration today, one team's working on Terraform and Ansibles and all those things. They deploy something, and 2 days after, the vendor says, oh, we needed a CRD as well. Oh, the secrets and role bindings are missing. We receive that information in a separate email. Then a separate team works on a CI/CD pipeline to apply that to the configurations. Now, a different team, a different people, a different domain actually works on the VNF manager, who actually looks at the network function and Helm charts and it deploys that. And maybe a third one is looking at how to create a policy and closed loop and look at the analytics and assurance. I think that's the vision of Nephio, to actually bring all of that in sync. It is doable. It's just the way how we solve that problem. It is doable if we do it in a Nephio way.
So in one of your slides, I believe where you had your, not the next one, the one more. Here, where you say operators are powerful, intent-based, and designed for stateful application, did you mean to say stateless applications as opposed to stateful?
Stateful. So the applications that maintain a constant state are better expressed using operators, and that's what the operators in Helms are distinguished by the Kubernetes community themselves. Like if you go and look up the differences in the Helm and operators, that's what comes up. It's because the operators have a mechanism of associating your existing state and the ability to reconcile that with the desired state and maintain the drift. That property doesn't exist in Helm. And that is why I said it's more stateful in its management of network functions, lifecycle management.
The reason I was asking this question is that in your 12-factor app, you were talking about
Stateless.
Stateless part. So if your applications are going to be stateless always, wouldn't be the case?
Yes. In the database sense, if the application is stateless, it's better. The two different contexts of the state, that's why I think these two are a little bit conflicting. But if it is stateless, it's even better. But it's stateless, but it still requires the lifecycle management in the operational domain, right? So in that sense, operators would be better and more declarative in managing the D2+.
Great talk. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I will see some of you in the Nephio Summit tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining here.